Hello, everyone. Before we get started, I'd like to go over just a couple of things that would make any Kotar swoon, and those are the ground rules. For questions, I know I joked last time, no questions, but I actually love questions. So if you have any questions, feel free along the way to raise your hand, loudly clear your throat, or go ahead and shout any obscenities you like. I've heard them all. That was fast. And no, I will not stop. But seriously, though, feel free to go ahead and ask any questions along the way. I'd like this to be an interactive session. I really hate talking at people. I like talking with people. The source code for all the examples we're going to go through will be available. They're on GitHub now. They're also on the Quotient Drupal GovCon website. They are on this slide at least 3 times, I think, because 1 was just not enough. And finally, how many here attended the Baltimore Drupal Bodiless session or saw the YouTube video? Magic? Okay. So I promise you there will be no references to a certain artist who may have been used a few too many times in no certain capacity by a speaker who will remain nameless. Or not. Okay, so anyway, my name is Paul Day. I've been developing web applications for 15 years. I've been doing Drupal for not quite that long. I started off in Drupal 6, more recently doing Drupal 7 and 8 support for federal customers mainly, but also our educational institutions and some private sector clients as well. But that stuff's boring. You don't care about that. That's not why you're here. So let's take a look at the agenda we're going to have for today. We're going to look at the problem that we're trying to solve. There's actually more than one problem, so it's just problems. But we'll also take a look at the setting that we work within. We'll take a look at the typical solution. The alternative, which is Bodiless Drupal, which is why everybody's here. So you do have to unfortunately suffer through 3 terrible slides full of god-awful jokes until we get to the real good stuff. We'll take a look at the benefits of Bodiless Drupal. And then we'll get into the good stuff, which are all the examples. Those are the code examples. We have quite a few of those for you today. We'll also extend Bodiless a little more and add in the Headless part. So we are basically writing Drupal without Drupal. And then finally, we'll go over some of the experiences we have implementing this bodiless type of solution. All right, so before we get started with the problem, though, I just want to take a moment. You'll hear a lot about big data as we go through this bodiless presentation, but do realize that this also works for small data, medium data, hardly any data. But the main point of that is that this is great for proofs of concept. So if you want to have a site start quickly and not deal with your users saying, well, that's not something I would post. It says this. You can actually pull in their data rather quickly and start off with some resonating facts for them. All right, so what is the problem? The problem is we have all of this domain content, and we spent a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of training on it. So what we are trying to do is maximize the investment that was spent on these existing systems and minimize the disruption to the users, and that includes things such as new workflows, user training, and also the pain point that any good developer will put on the OCIO department. We also want to accommodate the evolution of existing systems. So as requirements change, systems have to change to match them as well. And with a lot of existing systems, sometimes those things will change out of your control. The good part about this is there is an open standard available that kind of alleviates the pain of that. It's called the Content Management Interoperability Services, CMIS. Anybody heard of that? Yeah? Okay, good. One yes. Victory. Small victories. So that's basically a layer that lives on top of proprietary and open source content management systems. It gives you a consistent way of connecting to them, retrieving the data. So you're taking all of the guesswork out of the underlying system and don't have to worry about how the data is structured. You're just able to access it directly and get that data out of that system, which is one of the core features of Bodiless Drupal. So systems like SharePoint and Alfresco support those. They supply a CMIS layer. And Salesforce and Drupal are actually two of the bigger implementers of that. Third is, can we facilitate the transition to Drupal as an interim approach, or better yet, a long-term solution? We're not in the business of putting other CMSs out of business. That's not the purpose of Drupal, I think. But the short answer to this is yes, we can. So Drupal is ridiculously flexible. You can use all of it, you can use some of it, you can use hardly any of it if you want. So that means that certain projects can use maybe just the data layer, they can use the presentation layer, and you can have developers working in one area with designers working in a totally opposite or a totally other area. I shouldn't say opposite, I'll make all the designers angry. So it also lets you dip your toes into Drupal without making any massive investments. Like we know some of these systems, like if you were deciding to go from SharePoint to SAP, you better get that checkbook ready. With the Bodiless Drupal approach, if you decide to try things on the front end a little bit, dabble your toes into it, the only real expense that you're putting down is the time to maybe learn Drupal. The CMS is free, and a little bit of hardware to stand that up on. So let's take a quick look at the setting. So the typical organization or agency or government, non-government federal entity, did I say that right? Has tons of usable domain data in multiple locations. So what are we talking about with domain data? These are the flat files, the Word documents, the PDFs, the XML, JSON data, SQL Server, human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together to mass hysteria, all types of data. The other part of the setting is we also have to preserve the current systems. So in this case, migration is not an option. So we have well-entrenched processes, which means that there would be tons and tons of disruption. And remember that ROI thingy we keep talking about. It's very important, not to the developers. The third piece of the setting is the solution must fit within the existing infrastructure. So let's take a moment and think about the perfect world. Imagine your property officer sitting in the desk, minding his own business, and you come over for the great shakedown. You need the servers, you need the hardware, you need the software. Now let's imagine the real world. And you go over to your property officer and you beg him for the hardware and the software, and he tells you to go take a hike. So the good thing about Drupal is that it will fit within any infrastructure that will support Apache, PHP, and MySQL, which is basically every infrastructure on the planet at this point. So the typical solution, we have our problem, we have our setting, we have tons and tons of data, we have an old system that is not supporting our needs or anything. So we would end up going all in with Drupal. And going all in is a painful experience sometimes. Sometimes it's necessary to migrate your data while you're sunsetting an application or retiring a legacy system. Other times it can be very disruptive, expensive, and it can waste those prior investments. So we're not saying that Bodiless Drupal fits into every situation, but it fits into many situations that we can run into. So for the typical solution, we're really talking about Drupal. This is Drupal out of the box. Site users, end users, administrators, they all go in through the different areas, they access Drupal, they hit the internal MySQL database, and 98.9% of them are happy. And now we'll look at the alternative, which is Bodiless Drupal. So we called it Bodiless Drupal kind of to be funny. Mainly I couldn't say disembodied Drupal very well, so we had to shorten it up a little bit. Also, it probably wouldn't be such a serious discussion as we're having today if it was something called like topless Drupal, maybe look ma no pants Drupal, one of those kind of things. So what exactly is Bodiless Drupal? I'm sorry, these transitions are rough at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. I'm sure most of you are probably thinking about the Beltway traffic and how the hell it's going to take 4 hours to get home. Yeah. So Bodiless Drupal at its core is just the different ways that we can architecturally use the pieces of Drupal to get the things done that we need to get done. And that's really it, minus the data, of course. So we're talking about security, routing, templating, theming, rendering, configuration, web services, all the good stuff that Drupal provides. But you're going to say at this point, this guy's an idiot. This is the same diagram he just showed me a slide ago. And I would agree with you on a Friday afternoon. But since it's a Tuesday, the one thing that we are missing from this diagram is all of that external domain data. So you can see there's a fancy little straight line from Drupal directly out to the domain data. We're skipping over the MySQL database completely. And this is possible through many, many, many sources. We can access this data through APIs. We can go back to the CMIS initiative to get that data. We can even access it directly in some cases. But what are we talking about when we talk about domain data? We're really talking about content repositories, external databases, file systems, static HTML, APIs, or CMSs. Really, it's anything that is data that your organization either creates or uses. So, are there any questions so far? Okay. I don't hear any shouting, so either I'm doing an awesome job, this presentation completely sucks, or you guys have already checked out. I'll choose option 1. Okay, so let's quickly take a look at some of the benefits of Bodiless Drupal. Now, I know we have been focusing a lot on the large data, but this also works for small data sets. And as you'll see in the examples that we're going to go through in just a little bit, those data sets are very, very, very small, consisting of an entire 2 records. So the benefits of using it with small data as well is that it's fantastic for proofs of concept. You can quickly spin up a site and get rid of all those annoying things that developers hate when customers look at things and say this button should be green instead of blue, and you're like, that's not the point of what we're doing right here. They can see their actual data on the screen, and that alleviates some of those issues. So I would like to say, lorem ipsum, your days are numbered. It's also possible to ease into change. So you're not diving in completely head first. You're not taking everything you own and betting it on a single CMS. What you're doing is you're starting out with bits and pieces of Drupal and bringing in your external content while keeping all of your existing processes and workflows in place. And finally, and this is probably the most important part, is that we're still using Drupal. Bodiless Drupal is just an implementation of Drupal. It doesn't pigeonhole you down the rabbit hole. Well, I realize they are 2 different animals, but there we go. I'll get you guys to laugh at some point. I'll just keep pounding you with these horrible jokes. But you're not stuck down this rabbit hole of saying, oh, I went through Bodiless Drupal, now I have to completely trash everything because they want to bring the data over. You don't. You really, in the end, all you have to do is migrate your data. You can keep your modules, you can keep your views, you can keep your structure, your security, your configuration, all of it, just bring in your data. So in a sense, you're future-proofing your applications. All from a demo, if we could just do that from all demos, right? Okay. So I know it's been extremely exciting so far. I'm thrilled. But now we'll get into the fun part. So we'll get into the code. I'm sorry I don't have free cards to give away. First of all, they're expensive, and second of all, I think it's illegal for me to do that for some of you in the room. And I don't really want to go to jail. All right, so let's take a look at our first example here. And this one is just going to be a simple flat file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up the examples in Drupal first just to show you they work. And then we'll look at the code and show you how they work. So our first example here, see, is pulling in just an external text file into our Drupal instance. Don't you make a liar out of me. So speaking of animals, I may have to put the hamster back on the wheel. There we go. Stalling is your friend. Okay, so we can see in this example, this is a sample text file. It's pretty boring, right? So taking a look at the code is also going to be pretty boring for this one too, which is a good thing though. So we have our typical routing file. And can everybody see this okay? I can switch it to the white background if it'll be easier.
No, it's good. It's fine.
Okay. I have like 6 yeses, so that's plenty. All right, so what we're going to do is going to pass in a optional variable into our path, and that's going to point to this external file here. And it calls our controller for the content method. And you can see the content method is just 12 lines. So we've pulled in external data into Drupal 8 from a flat file with 12 lines of code, plus the other rigmarole Drupal makes you go through to get a module set up. But you can see how really simple it is here, and this one even includes a little bit of error checking if the file doesn't exist. So it's very, very, very simple to pull in just that piece of external data as a flat file. So the second example we're going to look at is just a little bit more difficult. This one's actually going to include JSON data, so there's a little bit of structured data in here. This one's a good example because a lot of your systems will be able to export JSON data. Drupal itself actually supports web services in a JSON format. So this one is probably one of the more useful examples in here. So we can see it pulls in our JSON file. It says, hi, my name is Paul Day. It also says, hi, my name is Rebecca Bartlett. And she did ask me before she left to send all of your comments and hate mail directly to her. The guy at the top just doesn't know. All right, so if we take a look at this guy, we can see that the routing file, this is part of the other example, the routing file is basically exactly the same. We're passing in an optional path parameter that just points to the sample JSON file this time, runs our controller for the content. And when we look in the content, this one is heavy duty. This one's like 18 lines. But what it does is it goes through, it reads the JSON file, and it iterates through the data, adds the output to a holding variable, and then returns a renderable array. And that's pretty much it. We've included external data in a Drupal application, and this would take you about 7 minutes to stand up and to demonstrate. So you can imagine the power that that would supply to one of your users, your end users, your customers, clients, to be able to show them their data in real time, in a real application, in a demo environment. So the third example we have here is an external MySQL database. Ooh. And you'll see this one looks remarkably like example 2, and I promise you I did not cheat. This is actually coming from another database. I can prove it. This is our main Drupal database, and we have a users table here, and all that's in that users table is just 2 records. Rebecca and I. Sorry, Rebecca. So we'll take a quick look at the code on this. And actually, I'll stop first. Does anybody have any questions on the first 2 so far? No? God, I'm good at this. For the third example, this one's going to look amazingly the same as well, though this time we do not have the optional path parameter on here because we're calling data directly from the database. So looking at this code, what we're doing is we are making the most important line, I think, of this entire thing, is that you're telling Drupal to use this other database connection. And this other database connection is actually defined in the settings.php file. So I know some agencies will lock that file down, so you may need to do a little bit of pocket greasing to get this one in there. But we'll basically set this up like another connection inside the settings.php. We'll tell Drupal, hey, I want to use that connection. We'll get a connection to it, and then we'll run with our select statement and loop through the results. There is some error checking in here. We do want to wrap most of our database calls, well, all of our database calls, with error checking. In this case, we have a general exception. We also have any PDO exceptions that are coming directly from the database and passed through the Drupal database object. And the second most important thing is in this finally statement, we're going to tell Drupal to switch back to the internal database. If you don't do that, things will explode. Your customers will be unhappy. The bills will stop being paid. The lights will be shut off. You'll be kept out of a job and shunned in the entire Drupal community. I was like, I guess that would just be me. All right, so I know this one's a little bit more involved. Any questions so far before we move on? I promise you it gets worse. Yeah.
So you talk about which modules you use to kind of put this framework together?
Yeah, none. So that's the awesome part about Bodiless Drupal is that you pick and choose the pieces that you want to use. So all of these modules are custom. They're very small, but what we did use is we use the internal mechanisms of Drupal that are supplied already. So we have like some routing in there, security in there, definitely relying on the configuration to pass in some of the variables that we need and those kind of things. In the next example, we do use some modules in that one, so it kind of expands a little bit on just the Bodiless piece. All right. So, like I said, all of these examples will be available or actually are available on the GitHub page. You can get there through the session page, through the Quotient website, or I lied. There's only 2 instances of that URL in here, but they also are on this business card, I think, that was forced upon a few of you, maybe over the past day or 2. I sensed some laughing, mainly from the people who did the forcing, but I guess some of you have those limited collector editions items. It's on there as well. Okay, so we're going to stretch our imaginations at this point. So what we've been tasked with is figuring out, this is great, Bodiless is great, but I don't want to learn Twig. I don't want to learn how to template inside of Drupal. I want a lightweight web framework, right? I want kiosks. I want interactives. Heck, I watched an 8-minute YouTube video on Node.js, and now being the 8-minute expert on Node.js, we're going to write one in Node.js. It's crazy how that happens. It's a true story. But you'll say, Paul, you're driving me nuts with this Node.js stuff because I already wrote modules. I have views. I have security. I have routing. I have everything that I need in Drupal. Why are you taking this away from me? But as Bob Marley said, he knew the music reference was coming, right? Don't worry about a thing, because every Drupal thing is going to be all right. So when you're using Bodiless Drupal, you can use any part of Drupal. Which leads us into extending this just a little bit more and moving into Bodiless and Headless Drupal. What part is actually Drupal? So I've taken the least popular topic in the world, Bodiless Drupal, and merged it with the most popular topic in the world, Headless Drupal. And we'll end up somewhere in the middle. So what we have is we still have Drupal at the core. Site administrators will use Drupal to administer things, content, people will use them, authors, they can still access and edit the data. But the end users will have a completely different experience. What they'll go through is they'll go through a kiosk that's accessing the external data directly, or maybe it's going through the Drupal Remote Web Services API, like a Node application with like the one we're going to do, and I just gave it all away, I'm sorry. So Drupal ends up being the framework, and what it's used for is it's used for managing the domain data. We use it for content and security. We also use it for providing the domain data through the RESTful Web Services API. And it'll handle the request routing as well. So our domain data lives elsewhere, and then we're just going to slap a new, shiny new Node.js front end on it because of that 8-minute video. So let's dive right into the example. And this is going to be our example number 4. So let me run this one for you first. As you can see, I do have a Node.js server running here. All of these instructions are part of that GitHub page as well. I made sure that you're going to totally get inside of my brain, and it's a completely scary place, but it's safe on GitHub. So when we run our example, what we end up getting back is a single record from our external database, and this is driven through a Node.js application. I know it's infantile, right? Very infantile. But it was only an 8-minute video. That's the best I can do. So if we take a quick look at the source on this one, you will see this one is remarkably different from the other ones. We don't have an info file. We don't have a routing file. We don't have a module file. We have this REST resource plugin thing that's sitting out there. And really all this is this lets Drupal know through the notation at the top. This is the one of the new things in Drupal 8. You can use notations at the top of your classes to give Drupal extra information without coding anything at all. So what this says is when I request this URL, so it'll be ex4rest/id, that I want to call this web service and return this resource. So the code for this one is basically exactly the same as the MySQL database code because we're doing the same thing at the Drupal level. All we're doing with Drupal is we are accepting the route, pulling out the parameters, querying the external database, and returning that result in this new thing called a resource response. And what that does is it magically converts the data that I retrieve from MySQL into JSON. And the reason it does that is within my Node.js request, you can see I'm calling ex4rest with an ID of 1. And I have this crazy thing on the end. This is the special formatter that tells Drupal, hey, this is a real web service request. I need the data returned from this thing in JSON format. And that's just one of the formats it supports. It also supports XML formats. There's also a HAL module on there where you can do HAL JSON. Or you can, one day decide to be a good RESTful community developer and create your own format, because that never happens. Just make sure you document it, because that also never happens. So we can see from the simple Node.js application, all it's doing is it's calling this path on this host, getting the response, and writing it out to the screen. So that's it. I've created, after my 8-minute video, I have created a powerful Node.js application that vomits out JSON to the screen through a Drupal RESTful web service API call to an external database. That just completely blew everybody's mind, I can tell. Yeah. Either that or it went way too far over. So, other than these really silly examples, oh, I forgot. This was my favorite one too. Terrible. I saw Maury and I had to do that one. I figured I have Oprah in there. Might as well put Maury in there, right? Hand in hand. Okay, so does this really work? So before you think that, hey man, this Paul guy is just a total nerd having fun up here. I'm not. I'm actually sweating pretty profusely. Just given the opportunity to make some completely horrible jokes. And thank God for editing, because they were much worse. Here's some of the real world examples that we've done. We've done some Drupal 6 work in this. We've done Drupal 7 work, and we've also done Drupal 8 work. So what this goes to show you is that this really isn't just a Drupal 8 thing, though Drupal 8 does make it far easier than Drupal 6 or Drupal 7, but you can also accomplish the same thing regardless of the Drupal version that you're using. Of course it is, otherwise it wouldn't be here, right? So the answer is yes, and the reason the answer is yes is because of Drupal's robust, flexible framework. It is ridiculously flexible in the pieces that you can pick and choose to put together or pull apart an application. It's completely up to you. It's also possible because data migration is not required to leverage non-domain data or non-Drupal domain data. So we can leave legacy systems alone. You can take your time in migrating that data. You can wow your users immediately with authentic demonstrations of their content in a new front end. We also can stretch this a little bit further, and I think we have time for another demo. Everybody want another demo? Yeah, all right. Okay, so what we've done in this next demo is we've completely taken away any care for what the system of record looks like. So we're going to use JSON to create a schema. And I promise you I won't go through every single one of these files. Afterward I will, though, if you want to. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a JSON schema. And what this schema is going to do is it's going to define two things. It's going to define the data that lives in the external system. And it's also going to give us a way to dynamically generate a Drupal form based upon that data. So here is the actual data for the content type. You can see that in that section. And then here is the schema, or the data that we're using to set up the form. So what we're doing in Drupal is we just create a very, very small module, and it goes through each one of these authoring form entries, and it looks at the type. And it says, okay, this is a field type of hidden. And then our module will take and convert this into a hidden field type. Does the same thing for text, selects text areas, radio buttons, anything you can think of. Now there is a little bit of heavy lifting involved in creating the module that reads this in, because you do have to code all the different options that are available for the HTML elements. But that's like a one-time endeavor. I can't remember the last time HTML changed. It was like 1997, right? So what we can do with this one is generate these forms on the fly based upon this JSON data. So let's say you're using SharePoint 2012. Pretty progressive, right? So you come out and the OCIO says, okay, we're going to SharePoint 2013. So there's naturally going to be some structural changes to the data underneath of that. Now, instead of trying to figure out what all of those changes are, what you would do is, or implementing all of those changes, you would just kind of determine what the changes are, add them to this JSON file, and it would magically generate those new elements for you. And we can kind of show what the outcome of that is. This one, the auto-generate Drupal form based on a JSON schema example. So what we have here is we have some sample data. This lives in a JSON file, a JSON data file. So what we're going to do is we're going to edit this data element directly. So at this point, we're now editing the data that lives in the JSON file. But there was no module that generated this form. Well, I just completely lied to you. I apologize. It sounded awesome when I said it. It didn't make any sense after I heard it. So the module that generates this form is only using the JSON data. There's no Drupal form arrays generating this in real time. So what we can do is we can go in and make just a minor change, and just add some more Fs on there. It's feeling frisky. And we'll save this thing. And you can now see the title has been updated. And the JSON data, which is here, you can see it changed. It's orange. We can now see that our title now has all those crazy Fs on it. So what we've done here is we've completely taken out the dependencies on the external system and now allow Drupal, through basic configuration, to manage those dependencies and contribute the form back to you. And this is awesome if you hate maintaining legacy systems, like some of you probably do. And like I said, all these examples, plus more, there's actually 2 bonus examples that we won't go through here, but they're kind of some helper examples as well. They're available on the GitHub repo. You made it. Well, I guess I made it. So, a question. Thank you.
So I ran into the need for something similar to this. The data was affiliate fee data. So basically you're passing product information through and providing links for people to purchase. No entities being created, right? You're just using Drupal for the services.
Right.
And I ran into a limitation. I'm wondering if you found a way around, and that is if you're not creating entities, when it comes to keyword searches, there's no indexing taking place because there's no entities.
Right.
Did you find a way around it?
Typically in those projects, I'm sorry, I'll repeat the question because I know it's recorded. This is just looking for a way around dynamic data not existing inside of Drupal, but being able to search for it by keyword. And typically we've used like Solar to accomplish that, where you have, whether it's cron jobs or real-time utilities when people are doing the searches, we can index them at that point. We would leverage Solar for something like that. And that also adds the flexibility of not just limiting it to what that entity would be. You can also add additional information to that to make that search even more robust.
So really you have to bring the data through far enough in advance to give Solar a chance to know it exists.
If you want to ahead of time, you can do that through cron jobs, and typically you would use the exact same process you would use for Bodiless Drupal to do that as well. You would just automate it. So not much additional effort, a little bit for the Solver stuff, but yes.
So example 5 seems to me that that would be with some extension, a way to sort of like be able to do like a curated migration without sort of batching through the migrate module or something like that, right? So that, for instance, you could query exposed external data, get it into the point where it's in a form, and then using an afterhook, actually bring it into your system, right?
Right. And that was, sorry, talking about example 5 for curating data through that same example. Yes, and we've actually done that before. And it's also a nice way to weed out all the garbage that's not being used anymore either, because in real time as those items come in, you can migrate them into Drupal, and you're only getting the stuff that people are really using anyway. So that kind of is a natural progression in the data that's stored in the system. But yes, very true. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I had a good time. I did. It was much better than the DrupalCon one. That was my first time doing this. And there was about 80 questions afterward, and I realized it was because the presentation was horrible and didn't include all the data it should, so all the questions that we had then were kind of incorporated in this presentation. So here are the links that we mainly talk about. We have the GitHub repository, our 2017 microsite, and then just another site to talk a little bit more about the content management interoperability services, which if you guys are using SharePoint or a CMS like that and you want to try this out, that is definitely the way to go. It makes this entire process so much easier.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay.